So we hear a great deal about Joe the plumber. Remember Joe the plumber? You've all heard of Joe the plumber, right? Now, we've all heard of Joe the plumber, at the very least. So if we're paying very little attention, we've heard of Joe the plumber. If we pay a little bit more attention, we know more about Joe the plumber, that he's not a plumber, and then he's not Joe either. Do you know this? That he's not named Joe and he's not a plumber. And he said that he was about to make a big investment and have a successful business and so on, and that turns out to be false. Basically what happened is the media looked into Joe the plumber and found out that Joe the plumber wasn't who Joe the plumber said he was, and it turned into a failure. It redounded to the disadvantage of the McCain campaign, and the press made a very big deal about that. So that McCain constantly talking about Joe the plumber in the debates made McCain look foolish. Okay, great, that's fine, that's terrific. Who cares, basically? How important is this? How important is it that Sarah Palin spent all that money on her clothes? Okay? All right, so it shows that she's not able to connect with working class. I don't know what it's supposed to mean, but do you take my point? I'm talking about a constant overemphasis on the theatrics of the moment. That how does it play? How is this playing? How does this new ad play? How did this statement work? What was his best line in the debate tonight? Well, I liked it when he said, that, this is all completely beside the point. See? And again, the problem is not just that they're not talking about the issues. The problem really is that they're not talking about the most important issue of them all in an election, which is whether or not our election system is secure and reliable and honest. This is a huge problem. It has been a huge problem since 2000. And it is all the huger and more grave a problem for the fact that they refuse to talk about it. Now, election fraud is nothing new. It has been with us through much of our history, and both parties have engaged in it. This is a fact. I'm from Chicago, okay? And some of you know what that means. That means that I'm well aware that Democrats have stolen elections. You know, in big city political machines, often dominated by Democrats from the late 19th century on up into the 20th century, election fraud was kind of a municipal sport. You know, it was just something people did, and there's no getting around it. This is a fact, and it is indeed the case that Mayor Daley helped JFK win Illinois in 1960 because there was a turnout rate in Cook County, which is where Chicago is, of 89%, which is pretty amazing. And this is part of lore, and everybody knows it, and people keep talking about it and so on. Okay? But let's be honest, when I said that both parties have engaged in it, let's also take note of the fact that in 1960, when Mayor Daley stole Cook County for JFK and helped JFK take Illinois, see, it was a turnout of 89%, it's pretty amazing. At the same time, in next door DuPage County, which is a Republican stronghold, it's the biggest Republican stronghold in the state of Illinois, Richard Nixon won with a turnout rate of 93%, okay? Which is even more staggering, right? It's gone on both sides, okay? It's always been with us, however, okay? Election fraud and vote suppression have taken a new turn. That what we're dealing with now, since 2000, is actually unprecedented. It's off the charts. We're talking about something that is far larger in scale, first of all. We're not just talking about city machines fixing the votes in counties and taking states by doing that. We're talking about a national level of vote suppression and election fraud. So the scale is different. Second of all, the technological sophistication is unprecedented, because now we're dealing with computerized voting systems that enable enormous levels of election fraud that are imperceptible, that often involve self-erasing computer codes. So it's extremely hard to perceive it And it's possible to steal votes, again, on a much larger scale because of that technological fact. And third, and most alarming, is that there's a different kind of ideological motivation at work behind the election fraud that's been taking place in this decade. Historically, parties have stolen elections for pretty obvious reasons. It's a way either to keep or to seize the spoils, right? It's a way to either keep or seize money, power, patronage, all too human. But the election fraud that we've seen in this decade is a little bit different from that because there's a considerable component that has to do not just with seizing spoils, but it also comes out of a real hatred of secular democracy. Because there is a very influential element of what we call the religious right that is interested in election fraud because they regard the secular majority as evil, as corrupt, unbelieving, and hopelessly averse to a pro-life agenda. This is new. As early as 1980, Paul Weyrich, who went on to become one of the most important figures on the religious right, was talking sort of publicly, that is to members of his movement, about democracy being a problem, that we don't want people to vote. Because if more people vote, that simply means that that particular theocratic agenda will just have a harder time prevailing. If you have a theocratic agenda, you obviously don't want people to vote unless somehow the majority becomes theocratically inclined, which is unlikely in the United States, you know, the US being a fairly diverse and tolerant place, and also a consumer culture. And consumer culture and theocracy have a hard time getting along together, see? So starting in the early 90s, Weyrich and his movement sort of took over the Republican Party and came to constitute the base of that party. So it's not the same Republican Party that your grandfather would have seen, you know, which was more about economic interests and less about what we call social conservatism. Well, let me talk a little bit about the press's non-coverage of this issue. And in doing so, I'll probably tell you some things that you haven't heard. The sort of blackout on this issue goes back to 2000. Now, how many of you know, and this may sound to some of you like a provocative statement or a partisan outburst or something, although I want to make clear to you that I'm not a Democrat. I mean, I'm from Chicago, okay? I'm not a Democrat. I'm an independent. I'm proud of being an independent. I believe in democracy. I believe in popular self-government, and that the winners of elections should be the ones who win the elections. That's what I believe. So what I'm about to say is actually a statement of fact, or a statement of fact posed as a question. But how many of you know that Al Gore won the election in Florida in 2000? So what is that, about a third of you? Okay, you've probably all heard that Al Gore won the popular vote, right, in 2000, but lost the electoral vote. How many of you heard that? Oh, it's like the same number. Okay. What happened was, after the 2000 election, over the course of about a year, all the votes in Florida were counted by the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, with the help of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Associated Press, CBS News, and Fox. They released their findings in November of 2001, and they found that Al Gore won the election in Florida, period. That is to say, if all the votes in Florida had been counted, and that's the standard we usually use in elections, we count all the votes, Al Gore won. He barely won. He won by between 92 and 300 votes. It's a tiny, tiny little majority. But he did win.